All right. Hey, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for joining us here on another DevOps.com webinar. And this is actually a special partner roundtable coming out of our AWS Community Hub or AWS Partner Community Hub, which is a new special section on DevOps.com. We've got a great lineup today to speak about, I think, a topic that is top of mind for many of us in the IT space, and that is Kubernetes. As I mentioned, the webinar today is sponsored by the AWS Partner Community Hub. Let me introduce you quickly to our panelists, but we're going to come back and introduce them later and have them talk a little bit about themselves. We have Chris Gaughan from D2IQ. Chris, thanks for joining us. We have Dan Papandrea, Field CTO at Systig. Hey, Dan, or Pop. And then Daniel Lizio Katzen, who is Head of Strategy and Partnerships with Weaveworks. Daniel, welcome. As I said, we're going to come back and have you each introduce yourselves to the audience. Joining us not on video, though, because of limitations around Chrome and Linux and Chromebooks, unfortunately, is Justin Garrison. And Justin is a senior developer advocate at AWS. So though we can't see him on our screen, Justin is joining us via audio. And Justin, welcome.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Thank you. All right, just a little bit of quick housekeeping here, guys. We use the GoToWebinar system here at DevOps.com and MediaOps. And for most of you, that means you see the GoToWebinar control panel in your upper right-hand corner of your screen. And there's a couple of particular sections I want to call to your attention. The first one is called questions. And I think someone's already put a question in there, or at least said hello. Okay, so we use the questions section for a very good reason. Number one, or for several very good reasons. Number one, you don't have to worry about remembering your questions when we ask for them. You could type your questions in as they pop into your mind stream of consciousness, and we'll have them in there, and I can ask them of our panel as we get going. This is not a slideshow presentation. This is truly a roundtable. So we will be taking questions right from the beginning. So as soon as you have a question, please type it in. If we have so many questions that we cannot answer them all, we'll have a record of them here. We could ask our distinguished panel members to send you, follow up via email with you to make sure we answer your questions and you get an answer. Everybody who asks a question deserves an answer. Third, with the flow of these kinds of roundtables, I will pick and choose questions to ask at the appropriate time as they fit into our flow. So it gives us the ability to better tailor questions to the flow of the conversation. So please type your questions in there. It's the best way to reach our panel, and it's the best way to get questions or get answers to your questions. Now, for most of you, down on the bottom of your GoToWebinar control panel, you'll see a section marked chat. We don't use chat to chat here on our GoToWebinar system. We use chat for technical support. So if for some reason you're having problems with the video or the audio, or you can't type a question into the control panel or something like that, but you can type in chat. Type it in there. We do have people standing by. We will try to rectify and get you the most use out of this that you can. Let me also say that today's roundtable is being recorded, and it will be available on demand probably within just a few hours of today. So with that out of the way, let me introduce you to our roundtable panel today that I think is second to none. Justin, since we can't see you, I'm going to let you go first. If you'd like to introduce yourself, your position, company to the audience.
Yeah, I'm Justin. So I'm a developer advocate at AWS, helping people be successful with containers in general, with all the products that we have. Also a pretty avid open source community member, have been in Kubernetes community for quite a long time, and previously have been using it for personal and professional situations, and I am a Linux desktop user in the year 2020, apparently.
Good for you. All right. 2020 is going to be the year the Linux desktop really goes mainstream. How many years have we all heard that, right? And still waiting. All right,
Hey,
next
man,
up.
Microsoft is doing it for us.
Yeah. Daniel Lizio Katzen. Why don't you go next, Daniel?
Sure. Hey, Daniel Lizio-Katzen. I lead partnerships and strategy here at Weaveworks. I have been doing cloud things since the term started back in 2006. First doing hybrid cloud, and for the last 3-4 years, been doing cloud native and all things container and serverless. Joined Weaveworks about 1.5 years ago. And I'm more technical, only slightly though, than my title may make me seem. So I'm looking forward to the discussion today.
And Daniel, just a little background on Weaveworks, maybe.
Certainly. So Weaveworks has been doing cloud native tooling since we started back in 2014, initially for microservices application management. We had the good fortune, although it could be a little bit of a mistake at the time, to build our first product, Weave Cloud, on Kubernetes, which of course was spun out in 2014. You know, Kubernetes was a little nascent, maybe for a production platform in 2014, 2015. So we ended up building quite a few open source tools to help manage Kubernetes in production. Known for Cortex, which is a enterprise scale managed Prometheus, something called Scope for visualization. These are all open source tools, and most recently Flux and Flagger for implementing GitOps. And so GitOps is a term that we actually coined here at Weaveworks, and we're big proponents and work pretty closely with both the AWS and Azure teams on making GitOps the way to actually operate Kubernetes. So we're excited to have the discussion today.
Excellent. All right, next up, coming at us from Long Island, New York, Limbrook, actually. Dan Pop Papandrea. Pop, welcome. Give us a little background and a little bit about Systig.
No worries. How you doing, Al? So
Good.
I'm Pop. I'm the field CTO at Systig. We are a secure DevOps company that provides visibility and security. We were born as an open source company. So if you think of something called Wireshark, our founder, Laura Stigiani, was one of the main developers of that. We're focused on applying deep visibility to enterprise container and Kubernetes environments. So like integrations with things like Fargate, CloudTrail, Prometheus integrations, and also like, runtime security and embedded inline scanning for like things like Fargate tasks and those type of things.
Very good. And then last but not least, we have Chris Gahn from D2IQ, Director of Product. Chris, welcome. A little background.
Thank you. I'm a Director of Product Management here at D2IQ, formerly known as Mesosphere. Came on board to build a Kubernetes business and then Kubernetes products here. I'm in charge of the platform side of things, which includes the CI/CD products that we have around Argo and Tecton, Kubernetes distribution, as well as our Kubernetes control plane for governance of clusters and workloads. In previous lives, I was an analyst at Gartner covering public infrastructure as a service like AWS, building Magic Quadrants and stuff of that nature.
Excellent. Excellent. Hey guys, all 5 of you, welcome and thanks for joining us. I thought it would be a good idea if we kind of polled the audience a little bit to get a flavor for who they are, where they are on their Kubernetes journeys, and it'll serve as a kind of frame of reference for our discussion today. So I'm going to ask a couple of questions. There's actually 3 or 4 questions here to our audience. And before I pop the polls out, let me say this.
Pun intended.
Yeah, exactly.
No joke. Boom.
All right, bada bing. But guys, in my audience, these polls are as good as you make them. If you don't vote, elections have consequences. But seriously, give us a little bit of a background here. It'll help our people fine tune into answering questions and talking about subjects that matter to you. So my first question is really, around AWS, and it's about, are you currently a customer with an active, and someone spelled installation wrong, I think, but on AWS, select one of the following, yes or no. Doesn't take long to vote. It's a yes or no question, guys. I'd like to get at least 2/3 of us voting here. We're over 50%. That's good. I'm going to close voting off though in 5, 4, 3. Come on, a few more people. 3, 2, 1. We're close. All right. I'm going to close this poll up. We made 67%. That's a beautiful thing. And let's see what we got here. Yeah, so about 2/3 of you are currently active on AWS, and that's great. The 1/3 who aren't, I hope what we'll discuss today will still be relevant to you. And thanks for doing that. Our next question is kind of, would you consider the organization you're working in a large enterprise, which to me is, I don't know, more than 10,000 people, mid-size enterprise, let's say 1,000 to 10,000, or SMB, under 1,000 people, right? And it's interesting because, we tend to think of so much of cloud and startups, but it's really the large enterprises that oftentimes are kind of leading the way with these things. I'm going to close voting up here in about 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. All right, we're right there, 67%, the same 67% vote. And results. All right, so about half SMB and then half in quarter large and mid enterprise. That's a little surprising to me. Usually on our webinars, we tend to get more large enterprise folks, but nevertheless, that's a great great insight into what we've got. All right, now kind of the money question here. How many of you actually currently deploy any Kubernetes-based applications? And we'll see if this matches our poll that we had seen prior to this. And again, we'll close voting up here in just another couple of seconds. And thank you all. There's 130, 140 people on. Thank you all very much for voting. I'm gonna got the same 68% this time. And let's see what we got. Results. Wow. So slightly more than half do not deploy Kubernetes at this point. 47% do. So I imagine the ones that don't are here to learn, maybe are looking to be convinced. Excellent. Now I'm going to ask our panel to comment on this in just a second, but let me do this fourth question real quick. Our current, in your opinion, obviously, are current Kubernetes deployment options too complex or otherwise beyond your organization's capabilities? And with more than half of you not deploying Kubernetes, is that a reason? So again, if you can vote here, and we'll get it done quickly, and throw it out at our panel, and kind of get their thoughts on some of your answers here as we kick off. So I'm going to close this poll in about 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. A little less on this one, but we're right about there. And our results. Interesting. So no is near 40%, which is good. 30% say yes, and a full 1/3, 33% say not sure. Interesting stuff. So my panel members, you seen the results here, right? This is the audience we're talking to today. Thoughts? You agree with the consensus? Disagree? What advice? I mean, this is a great jumping off point. Any ideas? Any comments?
So I have a comment. I mean, I've had, Justin, one of our panel mates on my podcast, which is the Popcast. It's on Spotify, Apple, and all of those things. And Justin talked about, he wrote a book called Cloud Native Patterns with Chris Nova, who works for Systig as well. And basically talking about like organizational changes that need to, permeate. It's not just a tech challenge when you're doing Kubernetes. If you're looking to, deploy these complex applications, having things like GitOps with what Daniel and team at Weaveworks are doing, and what Chris is doing with the control plane functions that they're, all of they're doing. You have to have that in place, but you also have to have this mindset of an organizational culture change to be able to like fit into some of these cloud native paradigms. And so the other thing is, the thought is, oh, well, I have a DevOps team and then a security team, trying to like have that be like have those be integrated and not be a burden on those teams. So you have to look for purposeful tools that are doing some of those functions. So that's kind of I can see that pull there. Yes, it is complex, but it's basically you have to adopt a mindset of culture change.
I think also something to remember, especially as we look out beyond the cloud and we start talking about enterprise customers, large and even mid-sized companies are right at the beginning of cloud native. Like you have to have a business reason before you start re-architecting applications and moving them to Kubernetes. And so we're seeing that start to happen. But really until 18 months ago, you had a little bit of confusion in even what the container management platform of choice was. You had ECS on the Amazon side, you had DCOS from Mesosphere out there, you had Docker Swarm. Now Kubernetes has really come to the forefront over the past 18 months, 2 years, but before that, there was a lot of competition in the market, and so a lot of folks were waiting until things shook out.
Interesting. Chris?
Sorry, going on mute. Yeah, I mean, you see more and more adoption. I mean, those customers that are moving from Mesos to Kubernetes, like we've seen at Netflix and Apple and other places. You also just see, I mean, it's gotten a lot less complex, at least to set up Kubernetes. There's still complexities around Kubernetes. I think people, when they're just starting out, tend to go turn it up to 11 and, not just start out with Kubernetes, but install Istio on their 2-node cluster, 3-node cluster, and, go all out. And so it's somewhat as complex as you make it. And, people tend to maybe go overboard when they're just starting out. And, there are things that you should be aware of that still require a decent amount of technical expertise, like Istio. Not to pick on Istio, but.
Yep. Justin, I'm just going to give you, if you'd like to comment on the polls, and then I want to jump into kind of the meat here.
Yeah, I agree with Chris here. When Kubernetes in any system can be complex, but you can also start very simple. And a kube control apply a YAML file is probably more simple than your Jenkins job that coordinates SSH get polls on multiple servers. And I've seen both, but we didn't think that the Jenkins option was complex because we built it and we understood that complexity. And when you run a new system that you don't understand the complexities or you didn't build it yourself, it now becomes foreign and you have to learn something new. So really it's about being comfortable with how complex you want to make it and what your goals are with what you're trying to adopt and how you're deploying your applications.
Guys, I'll tell you, I remember being at DockerCon in Austin probably 4 years ago, right? Kube is not in 1.0 yet, it's still beta. And and I'm sitting through session after session of people deploying Docker. And you're right, Chris, there was Docker Swarm, there was Messio, which, D2IQ was behind, and there was Kube out there, and I think it was 0.08 or something like that at that time, 0.07 maybe. But I remember my thought being, my God, this is really hard. I don't know. And not just Kube, by the way, the whole container deployment thing it certainly wasn't VMware on AWS, or not VMware. It wasn't a hypervisor on AWS, right? It wasn't quite that simple. And I remember thinking to myself, this is going to take some training. There's going to either that or they got to make it easier to use for widespread adoption. But nevertheless, here we are. Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, look, a lot of the complexity or perceived complexity comes from the fact that Kubernetes is, taking over a bunch of different layers that we traditionally had with the previous, SOA stack or even early microservices architectures, right? And so we kind of understood the discrete layers. We had our compute, we had our networking, we had our storage, and now you have something that, well, not storage so much yet, but we have something that starts to combine all of that together and enable the auto scaling and enable all of this functionality and really enable declarative infrastructure. That I think declarative infrastructure is the change versus imperative infrastructure that we saw going from kind of the legacy cloud architecture, if you can call it cloud legacy at this point, to cloud native architecture. And so that declarative versus imperative is almost like, CVS to Git, right? It's a different way of thinking about how you build applications. I may be dating myself by bringing up CVS, but we'll see. Looks like, Pop, you've got something to say there?
No, I just said in CVS, I was brought back and I was like, wow, cool, man. But I'm just saying in terms of the, the organization, like I said, I bring back the organizational challenge. You think about it, you said networking, you said, storage, you talk about, the compute, all of those things were all like, either separate groups or like, pieces of the puzzle. You talk about the security teams as well. It's like, those are the things that I go back to the whole cultural thing. It is an absolute cultural change. It's like now this is a complete DevOps or a secure DevOps function that you need to kind of have be this centralized place for deploying applications. So you need to make it less complex with tools like, DTIQ, Weaveworks, and obviously Systig, and obviously AWS. They make the world go round, right?
Yeah, but you know what? Let's not paint a false picture here. We could talk about it being complex and all the warts all you want. The fact of the matter is the container orchestration wars are long over, and Kubernetes is the clear winner. As a matter of fact, in our little synopsis, advertising this roundtable, we've seen recent studies that 70 or 75% of all new applications being deployed on AWS are Kubernetes based. It's hard to one side of your mouth to say, oh, it's too hard. And then on the other side of your mouth says 75% of all new applications are using it. How hard could it be? Right? And so, reconciling that, I think we got to remember that the numbers are what the numbers are. There's an awful lot of people using Kubernetes.
It is one of the greatest cloud native control planes that's ever existed. It has one of the greatest communities in the world by far. And the rationale behind it is everybody's working towards a standard goal. Different vendors, competing vendors. You have, Google's, you have the VMwares of the world, you have various folks contributing to this project, and in a way that's benefiting the end users. Of course, there's going to be adoption from it. And it's our belief here that it's something where you have to have functions where we're doing things like embedding Prometheus integration to CloudTrail, which is again there's an AWS there's an AWS paradigm with CloudTrail, and Prometheus is an open source project. So be able to see all of your services and CloudTrail functions in one place, to me, is again where it's this Kubernetes and open source is allowing these things to happen.
Yeah, I mean, I've worked on Kubernetes for over half a decade, and I remember a time where you could feed basically the whole community with pizza that you bought on your credit card. So it's amazing statistic to see that 75% of new applications are now on Kubernetes. And you do see that. I mean, there's people that used to joke around and say that maybe this would be the way of OpenStack. But you see, all the cloud providers now have Kubernetes services. Top 3 cloud providers all have Kubernetes as a service, as well as top vendors like VMware and a bunch of startup ecosystems as well. So I think that makes sense. It does make sense that, now that we have this tool, now that it's easy to do as a service or even on-prem or in the edge, that you're going to see a lot of new applications utilize it.
Yeah. And I just to pile on there, I think it will get easier as the hyperscale cloud providers really improve their managed Kubernetes offerings. And you see kind of the secondary tier, right? The Oracles and IBMs and some of the other folks they're making a play for the on-prem space. But I think we're also seeing the hyperscale guys do the same thing. Google with on-prem GKE, Azure with Azure Stack, and Outpost from AWS. So I think there is definitely a consolidation. I think the big thing that still needs to be tackled, at least from our perspective, is how to quickly and easily enable developers to ship their code, not just to Kubernetes, but to a typical pipeline where you have a multitude of different environments, and those environments aren't necessarily all are running in the same place. And that's what we see a lot in mid-market and enterprise, especially for regulated enterprises, is production's typically still on-prem, but we see a lot of dev and test and integration environments running in the public cloud. And so that's one of the more interesting developments, is how to make each of these different environments that are operated on completely different infrastructure actually function in the same fashion. And that's something that we spend a lot of time trying to figure out how to make that work. Because, you know, as a former developer myself, I remember my laptop is not the same as integration, is not the same as staging, which is old production, or production, right? So how do we make each of those environments the same for developers? I see that as really the big problem that Kubernetes will solve. It still has some rough edges, though.
I'll gotta give props to Weaveworks, and you know, because they have a tool called EKSctl. Fantastic tool. I mean, within like a, you know, and I had Cornelia Davis, who's the CEO, on my podcast. No, sorry to promote my show, but I'm starting again. And fantastic tool, because what this allows, you know, somebody to quickly bring up an EKS cluster and do the things that Daniel's talking about, being able to, you know, deploy code out to it very quickly, or deploy an instance and deploy their code very quickly through the GitOps paradigms. And then our side, like again, if they embed Systig on top of that, you have an inline scanner that's scanning the code and having like a release gate that if there's any type of vulnerability to it or some type of configuration snafu, it won't allow it to be promoted in the environment. Or even at a runtime perspective, have it say, okay, if this thing does something out of the ordinary, then, you know, we should, you know, stop the container and do something like that. So again, having all these things where you know, people are scared that, you know, Kubernetes is insecure, it's hard to deploy, it's hard to, it's too complex. These are the things that the community is helping, and vendors and all these things make it easier to adopt and put these things in place.
Yeah, and we actually wrote EKS Cuddle, which is an open source tool, right when EKS became GA, because it was frankly really tough to operate when it first came out. And the UI, the functionality that was available through the AWS control panel was limiting factor for how big your clusters could get. So we wrote EKS Cuddle and actually have a great community around it, and continue to add a lot of functionality there. And we work very closely with the EKS engineering team to make that stuff happen. So there's some good stuff in that CLI. So thanks for the props there.
So we're going to jump more into open source, hopefully, if we have time later today. But I want to make a distinction with that 75% of new applications. We're talking about new applications, right? These are greenfield applications where someone actually could sit down as an architect and say, "Ooh, we're designing this application. What do we want it to run on?" And you know, and you could pick all the shiny new toys and the latest and greatest stuff. Unfortunately, you know, the world doesn't work like that always. And that is, not all applications are greenfield. There's a lot of brownfield out there. There's a lot of app modernization, as we call it. There's a, you know, and shift and lift, and that's always messy, it seems. So what advice, you know, more than half of these people don't have Kubernetes in production right now, but they do have applications in production. What kind of best practices, advice do you have for people who don't have the luxury of painting on a fresh canvas here, right?
Yeah, so I come from this, from, you know, joining Mesosphere, now D2IQ, and this is a space where you need to earn every single dollar. I don't think that the true issue here is moving the applications, because I've seen people move tens of thousands of nodes to Kubernetes, large scale clusters to Kubernetes. And so what I think happens, and what slows people down, in my experience of working with customers, is that you have this dividing lines between the teams, which doesn't always work out so well. Like, they might have a networking team that's completely isolated from their Kubernetes product. So they have to use an existing VPC, and to get a new VPC, you have to go through so many hoops. So that's what I've seen slow down this application migration, less than, you know, it's just tough to move things. I've seen people move a lot of applications to Kubernetes. When there's a will, there's always a way.
Justin, how about you?
Yeah, from my experience, the migration path is a lot about unspinning that complexity that you have. The complexity you've built into your build pipeline or your workflow of how do I develop something, how do I fix a bug, and then how do I deploy and test that. And there's still a lot of cases where that's manual for people, where they say, oh, well, I run it manually and then I curl an endpoint and see if the thing, is still happening that's a bug. And then we, push it into code and add a pull request and someone signs off on it. And a lot of these steps are still manual, and the workflows for containers in general and especially for Kubernetes is a lot of automation. And we're seeing a lot more of those, basically the departments, the networking, the operations people and the developers collapse into an automated API with things like controllers that Kubernetes provides. So many more controllers are now automating not just things inside of Kubernetes, like I can run my my deployments and my pods and get a load balancer, but also things like AWS controllers for Kubernetes allows you to like deploy other things like external AWS resources, and Google has a similar thing. There's a lot of collapsing onto this Kubernetes API, where more and more things are, the Kubernetes API is becoming the standard interface on how people interact with their infrastructure and how their deployments and their application actually gets resources. And so a lot of that is about collapsing your complexity of, again, your Jenkins, your Groovy files, your SSH commands, whatever it is that you had for your old deployment that was pre-Kubernetes, maybe not in containers, and now moving that into a fully automated containerized world is a different type of complexity. But I think the industry is starting to lean into that, as far as like, we like the semantics for this API, and we like this declarative nature, and the controller, like GitOps is a good example of, it's a controller that looks at a Git repo and Kubernetes resources and makes them the correct thing. And I don't need to have a bunch of if statements in a bash script or something. I can just do that with the controller and it does the right thing. So it's a lot about adopting a new style of complexity and really doing a lot more automation that spans across those teams, as Chris was mentioning.
I think too, and I'm going to say something very controversial, Alan, but I'm going to say it. I mean, look, there's a tool for every task and there's a task for every tool, right? So Kubernetes might not be the best thing for your specific workload. I mean, there's, for greenfield applications, obviously that, you have some of the benefits of like health checks and ingress and all of these things that you would have. And so you need to kind of do a gut check and see, where you want to move these things. You may want to do things like move these things to like serverless platforms like Fargate, or you may just want to keep these on legacy EC2 hosts. And so having, functionality to be able to like monitor the visibility and security of these things, across those things are things that, you need to kind of think of as you're taking these applications and moving them over if you need to.
Yeah, I mean, to what Justin said, there is complexity in Kubernetes, but there's also a lot of simplification around toolchain. Since we primarily at Weaveworks deal with pretty large companies, the political or the internal politics of who owns which tool and who owns which part of the stack traditionally almost always comes up. And so what I really like about using GitOps is you can keep all your existing tooling. What teams tend to find is that they can start to eliminate that tooling pretty quickly. And a good example is you can set up a very, very nice GitOps CI/CD pipeline that runs from your dev to your integration to your staging, that's just using something like GitHub or GitLab, actions or pipelines for the CI side, Flux and Flagger for doing the GitOps functionality. And then that's deploying out to EKS, AKS, GKE. That works really, really well. You don't need much more in terms of tooling in there. Now, you probably want something, as Pop was saying, to scan those containers and from a security standpoint, but you start to end up with a simplified tool chain versus early DevOps where you could have 10 different tools that's in your pipeline. The other thing that we're seeing a lot is that CI/CD is what people want to a point in large enterprise. The idea of continuous deployment, continuous delivery works great usually to your QA staging environment, but almost never do actual large enterprises want to see CI/CD in production, right? They want somebody to push a button so that there's still an audit trail. And so being able to set that up so that it works in a fashion that doesn't piss off the CISO is, something that is nice about GitOps, because every single change is by pull request coming from Git, which is a tool that CISOs love. They love the auditability of. So it's something that we've seen migration to. What we have seen is this idea of progressive deployment, where you're using canaries or blue-green to production, is a way to automate and get to something that resembles CD, but is maybe a little safer for production. And so we're pretty excited about progressive delivery and what it brings as cloud native starts to mature.
I want to add one more point to that, Alan, that Daniel said. Again, you notice you mentioned like it involving the CISO, right? And again, these are the things that are happening recently. It's where the adoption's getting more and more. We talked about that 75%, because now you're involving the network teams and the security teams, right? And so again, it's this I said it in the beginning, the first thing I said was the organizational thing, because it used to be, hey, there's my DevOps team. They're just deploying applications, that's fine, whatever. Now it's the security teams like, well, we're putting mission critical applications that are public facing. And if we get a hit here, and we've read in the headlines about all the breaches that have been out there. And so you need to have tool-based integration. So like I said, from a GitOps perspective, from a control plane perspective, like what DTIQ is doing, what Weaveworks is doing. And then you need Systig, that is basically like a tool that's built. These things are built for the Kubernetes and DevOps and cloud native world. They're not built as legacy tools. You can't port over legacy tools to look at this new thing. And so that's also the challenge that people are moving over to this, because they have to look at the complete tool chain.
And not for nothing, but security came into the equation sooner than it's come into other equations in the past, but it was still a little bit later than the general rollout. But let me go to a quick question from the audience, right? Daniel makes the point, Jason makes the point that Daniel made a good point about, and Pop, you said it, you gotta have a good business case to move to Kubernetes. So just, a little bit of advice for our audience out there, for IT decision makers. What are, a simple kind of roadmap on what makes the business case for Kubernetes? What are the tipping points? What are the things that say, oh yeah, no, this would be, Kubernetes is the best thing for this, or Kubernetes may be a really great way of. Any advice for IT decision makers?
My esteemed colleague Chris, you got something, bud?
I've got a few.
Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
So a big one, right, is the general container benefit. What we see, especially with bigger companies, is low utilization on traditional infrastructure, because you're building for peak, especially with any sort of consumer-facing app. So you get that Kubernetes increased utilization. You can stack more applications in the same infrastructure. So obviously, that's appealing to people. I think a big one also is traditional virtualization takeout costs, right? Especially when you're talking about folks running hybrid. Getting rid of VMware attacks is a big one. In fact, that's a 8-9 figure bill for some of the companies that we work with, and that's an appealing savings there. And the third place is developer productivity, right? Being able to get developers code to the target environments without having to wait for manual environment provisioning, wait for help desk tickets, wait for all of the things that we've traditionally had to deal with on the developer side. So that's the biggest, but kind of the hardest to measure from our point of view.
Talk about, yeah, I was just saying, we talk about, again, the speed to deployment. Again, that's huge, right? Being able to deploy something quickly. Well, in the past, it's like, what did I have to do? I had to procure a VM, install my stack on it with some type of configuration management tool, right? Then I had to figure out how to monitor and all that fun stuff. So there's that, the speed of, just literally I can take an application and have it deployed, all three phases of it, right? So there's that. There's the MTTR, right? These mean time to repair. It's now I can look at this now and, oh, I got a patch that's going to address X, Y, and Z. So boom, like I need to, get that resolved. And I mean, even in large, customers, we had a very large investment bank that was basically looking at something through the lens of having this thing that was a polling mechanism. They were losing millions of dollars because they were tying something to a business unit where something was happening. They're trying to tie network connections to a process that was happening. And basically they were able to use like our tool to be able to and these new cloud native methodologies to be able to cut costs, because now they were looking at it as sub-minute perspective, because we're at the speed of a system calls. That's how we're able to tap into the kernel to be able to do that. And so that's, again, really key things that you're looking at, like for business value, like, hey, look, this is the business value of this, because, and also you're tapping into the open source world. So you don't have to have developers have to find, so some of the time these solutions are out there. They just have to tie this into, your own stack to be able to do this. So those are key advantages.
That's it. Chris, did you have something? I wasn't sure, and I want to make sure we give everyone a chance.
Yeah, I mean, that covers it pretty well. The only thing I would add is that it also allows you a medium to deploy all these applications that you would, cloud native applications that you particularly want in your enterprise now. Things like Kafka and, highly available Postgres. It just gives you a single API that you could easily deploy, and you can deploy them the same way no matter what Kubernetes you're using, whether it's in EKS or something on-prem. So I think that's a big added value that has popped up over the past year and a half, especially as operators have become more essential and important to Kubernetes. And I agree that, I've talked to a lot of people over the 5+ years that are just deploying Kubernetes, and you kind of scratch your head and you ask, why would you deploy it in this environment or for this reason? So you should take a step back and ask, is this the right tool for the job?
Always. Justin, last word on that before we hop to something else.
Yeah, I like the phrase, Kubernetes is really good for business, just maybe not your business, right? Like, understand what it is that you do.
That's a good one.
Understand what it is that you do and what your goals are, and focus on that, and deliver something there. And not to say that Kubernetes can't add value to what you're doing, but understand that it is a tool, and tools will come and go. And one of the benefits of Kubernetes is this gravity towards it, of so many vendors and applications and other things are starting to support it, either through a deployment, through a CRD and an operator, or just having containers and manifests that examples run on Kubernetes. Just the same way that Linux had, right? Like, Linux collapsed a lot of different operating systems into, hey, guess what? My statically compiled ELF binary will run on that Linux system and this Linux system. And Kubernetes brings that to a different level, where now you can span on-prem and in the cloud, and you can even go across architectures, where I can more easily switch from x86 to ARM. And could you imagine doing that before Kubernetes? It would just been like, okay, let's start from scratch again. We're not even gonna try to adapt this. But containers and Kubernetes allow some of those abstractions on top that really just add some of that value for flexibility. But really look at it as, is this something that your business needs at a certain scale and with your own organization's complexity?
Fair enough. Good stuff. Guys, yeah, I realize in polling our audience that we have an audience that maybe is not as Kubernetes savvy or as Kubernetes experienced as certainly our panel is, or as certainly as some people, we speak to on Container Journal and stuff like that. I want to make sure people realize too that Kubernetes is but one piece. We've used the term cloud native here a lot today, right? Kubernetes is but one piece of this cloud native puzzle, this new stack that we deploy on. When we talk about deploying 75% of new applications on Kubernetes, it's not on Kubernetes alone, right? There's this rich ecosystem that's developed. We call it cloud native, right? It's open source, but there's this rich open source ecosystem that surrounds everything we do, even Git. Daniel, you look at what GitOps is. It doesn't exist without the Git and GitOps, right? Kubernetes, someone mentioned Istio and Service Mesh, and all of these just amazing, just amazing tools and ecosystem. And we tend to focus on Kubernetes as the star of the show, but you can't have, I don't know if you can have a successful Kubernetes without the rest of that cloud native ecosystem nurturing it.
Without a doubt. I mean, the CNCF, again, is this, is nurturing all the governance between all of these projects. If you think about things like Prometheus, or you think about one of our projects, Falco, which is a behavioral rules engine for, for Kubernetes and cloud native, those are projects that people are contributing to, and they're benefiting the end projects that are happening out there. And Daniel, I mentioned earlier EKSctl. I mean, great, and that's an ecosystem contributing to that. But I go back to, like I said, Falco, where that's a function where people are putting in rules for things that are happening in Kube Audit Trail or things that are happening in their environment. So using it as a methodology, be able to see attacks that are happening from a security perspective. All of these accoutrement projects that are out there wouldn't have the benefit, like Kubernetes or all of those things, had the ecosystem not been driving that, or even Kubernetes community itself. I mean, you have people driving you have vendors, you have open source people just contributing great things that are making everything possible from this world. It's, again, I said it earlier, Kubernetes and open source CNCF projects right now are the greatest community in the world. Everybody is giving back.
And you can see that with the explosion of attendees, of course, before this year going to KubeCon, right? It was amazing how much it has grown over the past 4 or 5 years. Saying that, there's now almost 1,500 projects that are officially part of the CNCF. And so one of the challenges, I think, is a lot of those projects are overlapping on each other in terms of functionality, right? And so another thing, and so now that we know that the container orchestration platform of choice is Kubernetes, the secondary challenge is, what is the pipeline of choice, right? And I think this harkens back a little bit to technology stack choices, like, are you a LAMP stack, or even JavaScript frameworks, right? Are you using Ember? Are you using Angular? Are you using React? And so the challenge, I think, that we're starting to see is now a little bit of hesitance of adopting newer tooling and newer methodologies is around the fact that there is so much in the ecosystem, and so much of it is overlapping. And so
I don't know if that's a bad thing, Daniel. I mean, because you know what? There was a lot of overlap with orchestration. Someone on the, we had Swarm, and we had Messio, and we had Kube, and we had others, and the market, the community chose a winner there. And D2IQ today is D2IQ today, not Messio, as a result.
Mesosphere.
Rancher OS and everything else. Good, Pop.
No, I was just saying, I just wanted to correct you. It's Mesosphere.
Measure, excuse me. I got that funny French accent.
No worries.
But anyway, but you know what I mean. So I think what we're seeing here is market dynamics in action with CNCF, where there are overlapping. What's the right mesh tool? What's the right different things? But eventually winners emerge. Consensus is reached, and I think that's healthy for the community. Yeah, it's a little disconcerting right now because you don't want to pick a loser, right? You don't want to go down a dead end.
Yeah, and that is exactly my point. It's causing a little bit of hesitation in adoption because there's so many options there. Like the number of parallel POCs that you'll get in a large enterprise using similar tools for the same things is part of that, right? People don't want to end up picking the wrong tool. And I don't mean to pick on DCOS, but a lot of companies placed big bets 3 or 4 years ago on DCOS, and that ended up not being Kubernetes, right? And so now they're unwinding those, they're migrating applications, and there was a lot of money spent to basically undo the DCOS installations. So they're trying, that's causing some hesitation definitely in larger enterprises. And one of the things I think that's appealing about the pipeline simplification that we alluded to earlier is that will inevitably cause a little bit of clarity, right? An opinion is desperately needed. And so I don't think there's going to be one opinion to slay it all, but I do think that there are going to be use cases like ML/AI or other types of very popular new implementations where a use case is going to drive an implementation in terms of how the pipeline shakes out. And I think we're starting to see that a little bit around specific use cases. We'll see that more broadly, I think, around industries and use cases as we move forward.
Fair enough.
Yeah. So on the DCOS piece, it's not that they picked DCOS, they got a lot of value from it, and they were ahead of the curve because, as I said, you have to earn every dollar in this market, and so it is not hard to migrate from DCOS to Kubernetes or our new Kubernetes products that do it all the time. But on the general ecosystem question, we have on our Kubernetes distribution, 35 different add-ons that we have to keep track of and keep upgraded and patched. Everything from the monitoring to the logging to OPA for policy controls. That's a lot of stuff above Kubernetes. And when you take, the fact that some of these things only have an N-2 life cycle and they're released every 3 months, that you have CVEs, security vulnerabilities in each one of these that you need to track. And then you'd have patch upgrades that you just need for just regular bug maintenance. That's a lot of work if you're going to do this and you just have the base layer of Kubernetes. So I think a lot of organizations don't understand or appreciate that when they're going into this. And, they just install Kubernetes and they call it a nice day. Then they have to get onto the monitoring and the logging and, keeping that all up to date. And that's where they kind of get stuck a little bit.
Sure. Guys, we're running a little low on time. We only have about 8-9 minutes left. I wanted to talk more about security because it's kind of where I come from, security. Pop, Systig's at heart a security company, right? And
Security and visibility, yep.
Yep. And this is something that, again, I hate to see security be the caboose of the engine, of the train here. But you know what? We're seeing more and more now, though, that security around these kube deployments, these cloud native deployments, is an important, critical piece of the puzzle. And we're seeing a lot of innovation. We're seeing a lot of companies in the space. We're seeing Kubernetes security isn't a monolith. It's not like one thing that you do for Kubernetes security. Just like in every other part of the tech stack, there's different aspects of securing your Kubernetes stack, of your Kubernetes infrastructure, your deployment. Let's talk about what some of the different aspects of that are that people, should be cognizant of and need to, make sure they're on top of. Pop, I'm going to ask you to kick this one off if it's okay.
Sure, no problem. I mean, again, I'm actually doing a talk at KubeCon this year about, just basically embedding, making it easy to, because there's things you don't know about securing Kubernetes from the start. There's various aspects of it. There's obviously like authentication with RBAC and functions of that ilk, but also we're talking about, your build, run, and enforcement, meaning like when you're doing a build, you need to ensure that in that build, there's no vulnerabilities or no configuration snafus, but even at runtime as well. Where if I'm running a container, and this is where we talk about visibility being integrated there, I want to know what process in a cluster, if I'm running multiple clusters in Amazon or Azure or GKE, I need to know that needle in the haystack. I need to know what process is causing this thing to happen. So from a runtime perspective, you need to be kind of protected. And the key thing that, again, I think a security thing item needs to have is this postmortem. And so this capability for you to be able to see, okay, you know what, I created this rule set, I blocked it, but now I want to see, for instance, somebody came in and they wrote to this directory called Etsy Chris or Mezio, right? Something like that. So I could do things like, look at that and kind of, disseminate that action. And then the other thing is extending that capability. I might be doing workloads that are beyond just things on Kubernetes. I might want to integrate this with, like I said, CloudTrail earlier, where I want to understand like, what's going on in the environment outside of it. So I'm interacting with the services outside of my Kubernetes cluster. I might be connected to an external RDS integration or something like that. Or I might do something with Fargate where like, we, again, like talked about this earlier, having inline scanning, for that capability. So the idea here is that, again, there's this idea, and I talked about this earlier about average containers is around for less than 5 minutes typically, right? And so you need to do forensics and remediation when the container is gone. So you need a paradigm that's going to help you all the way, and a tool that's going to help you from securing your environment from build all the way to the post-mortem. And, I'm not trying to pimp out Systig, but I'll let you know, I think we do that well. So.
Fair. I wouldn't expect you not to.
I love my company. I do it anywhere I'm talking at, so it's all good.
Daniel, Chris?
Yeah, I mean, security is a key attribute that everyone's looking for, especially as I think people start to understand multi-tenant clusters a little bit more, because that's where it really starts to come up. And being able to continue to have monitoring, even with temporal objects like containers that should be being spun up and spun down all the time. But now, as you start to move forward and you start to add in serverless on top of that, whether it's Knative, whether it's Fargate, whether it's other projects that are out there, you start to get into this place where you may have a function in a container that's only alive for less than a second, and now you need to record what happened, who accessed it, who kicked it off, what was actually calculated in it, what the inputs were, what the outputs were. And so being able to maintain that that data, at least for a certain amount of time, so that there's visibility into what happened, is really key, because there's the one side of it is the attack surface of your Kubernetes environment, and the other side of it is what's the application that's running in the container, right? So there's a lot that we need to think about, especially as we move into a non and then I'll use permanent loosely, but a place where your compute environments last a lot less in terms of time.
Okay. Guys, I'd love to jump more into this, but we're really down to the last nitty gritty. I wanted to give each of you a chance to kind of conclude, if you will. Why don't we go in reverse order of, so Chris, we'll go Chris, Pop, Justin, Daniel. Fair? Chris, go ahead.
Yeah, I think this is a great conversation, and we heard a lot of things that hopefully the audience is taking away. One is that security is incredibly important when thinking about Kubernetes. The second is, don't try to fit a square peg into a round hole. Make sure that you're using Kubernetes for the right reasons. And third, do consider Kubernetes, because you do see that 70% of new applications are moving to Kubernetes or being built on Kubernetes now. And so this is a good time to get started, to look at the landscape and to start to get your hands dirty.
Fair enough.
I'm up. Yep. So I'm just saying, Kubernetes and containers are the future of software. We all know this. I mean, 75%, if not more, are adopting it, right? But your security needs to be addressed earlier. If you dress it later, it's going to bite you. If you dress it later, it's going to bite you later, right? So there's open source projects to get you started. And if you need a commercial solution, obviously Systig has tiers to help you add security in your adoption as you mature. And you take nothing else from today beyond the fact that this panel is amazing is don't delay implementing security and visibility in your Kubernetes implementation.
In anything you do, but that's good.
In anything, exactly.
Yeah, I saw some questions about different orchestrators too, and just want to address those. Like, I've run some very large scale ECS sites and infrastructure. Like, you don't have to do Kubernetes. Like, there are options. Yes, Kubernetes has a lot of that gravity and a lot of adoption, but again, look at what your business does. Look at how many people are on your team. Look at what you can handle. Same thing goes for security. I think one of the things that Meltdown and Spectre taught a lot of us is you can never have a deep enough understanding of security to do it yourself. Like, you're going to have to outsource some of this stuff to someone, and your developers should be focusing on the security of their applications, but you're going to have to rely on someone for security of the platform or of the Linux OS or of your whatever processors you're using. Like, it's so deep that no security expert has everything. Like, look at the things that are good for your business and can secure your portion of it, and outsource and get experts that can do the rest of that for you, because you can't do it yourself. And same thing goes for running Kubernetes, right? Like, if you're going to run Kubernetes and if that is your choice, don't try to do this yourself, because it was pointed out earlier, there's so many moving pieces and so many parts that have to go together, and you're going to spend a lot of time building Kubernetes and not shipping your product and whatever benefit your users have.
Yeah, and just to add on to that, both Chris and Justin have said a similar thing. There is a lot you have to manage when you put together your own stack to actually operate Kubernetes. And what I think a lot of dev teams do is they think about using Kubernetes for the application they're building, but they don't think about operating it after it leaves their hands, right? And so do think about, if you're going to choose to use Kubernetes, how it's going to be operated after the application that you're building moves into production. Think about the security aspects, think about how the application is going to move through the CI/CD pipeline. We love GitOps at Weaveworks, but there are other ways to do it. Although we think doing everything by pull request so it's repeatable is the right way. But really think about not just the build phase, but also the operate phase. And it is a lot when you put together your own open source based CNCF ecosystem project to maintain every single piece of software from a CVE and patch perspective once it hits production. So do look at the tooling and the number of tools that you pick. And
Fantastic.
also thanks a lot, Alan, for the opportunity today.
Thank you. You know what? Thank all of you, because man, I just like to show up and let smart people, you know, talk about it, and it makes my job much easier. But we're past the first of the hour. Hey, we do give out Amazon gift cards to a couple of lucky winners today. We've got Derek D and Glenn E, Lara B, and Rory M. Our team will be out in touch with you to get your Amazon gift cards out to you. And thanks for joining. Thanks to all of everyone. We had a lot of people on here today, so thanks to everyone for joining in. Special thanks to everyone on our panel. It was great. I sent a message out in the chat session to my panel members. I'd love to follow up with you. But for now, this is Alan Schimmel, DevOps.com, MediaOps, Container Journal, and the AWS Community Hub on DevOps.com. Thanks for joining us today, and we'll see you soon at another webinar. Bye-bye, everyone.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks.